So my birthday's coming up, and I have a bit of a dilemma. The main issue here is that the birthday is filled with shame, which is really weird. Usually birthdays are meant to be kind of a celebration, right? Um, Here's kind of my dilemma. I'm planning to celebrate it solo, but it's not out of self love. I ideally don't want to celebrate it solo. It's more of like a coping mechanism. And here's kind of like the situations that I mapped out for my birthday. Ideally, I would love to maybe rent a car, go on a hike somewhere, invite a few friends, maybe grab dinner after. That seems pretty chill, pretty fun. Maybe go to North Bay, past the bridge. Um, but here's the situation: if in case one, I text like three, four close friends, and it's just like a couple of us, and we go together, maybe just one car. The issue there is, it's just like two, three, four people. There's a good chance they're busy, and say they don't come, or they maybe just don't reply. They ignore me, or they say yes but don't end up showing up. So that would suck because then I feel like a loser. I texted like three, four friends for like a cute birthday thing. No one shows up. I'm a loser. That sucks. The other scenario, okay, let's host something big. I do tend to host stuff here and there. I go to a ton of parties, both here in SF and New York. So I could get like a bunch of people together. It wouldn't be a big party, because it's my birthday. I only want to invite closer friends. So it would be anywhere from like 10 to 20 people. Maybe get a venue or something, or a restaurant. That sounds fun, but that also has an issue because, if let's say I texted 20 people, a good chunk of them are going to be busy. They're going to be busy. They won't be able to come. Once again, a couple of them will say yes, but they won't end up showing up because something came up or whatever. A couple of them will say no. A couple of them just won't respond. And so similarly, I'm in a situation where I've texted like, let's say I invited 20 people, only 5 show up. Once again, I'm a loser. Why has no one showed up? Only 5 people came to my birthday party. I'm kind of a loser. So that sucks. But the problem here is I've mapped out 2 different scenarios, and both of them don't work. What I've done is I've created a shame trap. Every single scenario leads to shame, leads to kind of this me being a loser situation. And so my argument is problematic as well as my self-talk. How can I be cooked in every single scenario? There needs to be something that works, because everyone else celebrates stuff with people. Why am I cooked? And I host stuff and I celebrate, or I hang out with friends and I host stuff and people come. Why is it particularly for my birthday that this happens? And so there's that shame engine, as well as kind of this birthday trauma that I'm insinuating. So I want to dig into where that comes from, and why that's the case. And there's a story behind it. I was 9, and I was kind of this shy fat kid, not a lot of friends. I had super silky hair, so not kind of the curly hair that I have right now. Kind of like a nice kid, sweet, not anything particularly interesting about him. And I had a couple friends from school that I would play Minecraft with. This was pre-Discord days, which makes me feel like an unk. This was on Skype, so a couple friends from school, we would hop on Skype, we'd play Minecraft together. That was kind of my friend circle. And my birthday was coming up. I hosted a birthday party at my house. I imagine I probably texted like 7, 8 people. Some of these closer, maybe like 5, and only one guy ended up showing up, which I'm very grateful for. He brought this like Lego set, and we ended up being friends for many years after that. But no one showed up, which you can imagine really sucks for this 9-year-old kid. He's already kind of shy, doesn't have any friends, only has a couple that he speaks to, and no one ends up showing up besides this one kid. And so while this wasn't the real scenario, the lesson that the 9-year-old ended up learning from the situation, because as humans, we go through situations, anything that's painful, in this case, I felt lonely, I felt scared and sad. And so we learned a lesson so that our minds help prevent us from going back to the same situation again. The lesson I learned was about undesirability. The 9-year-old learned that I'm undesirable. When I celebrate something, do something where I'm the focus, people don't like me, therefore they're not going to show up. They don't care about me. I'm not worth deserving. Very rough lesson for this 9-year-old kid. But that's a lesson I learned, which I didn't know up until now. But that's a single event, albeit sure traumatic a little bit, but it's a single event. This is kind of a core belief, which I'll get into, that built up. So where did the rest of this really come from? I guess I'll kind of talk about it. What my mind ended up creating is a core belief filtering mechanism. Basically, you develop a core belief, some kind of important understanding about yourself or about society, about life, etc. And your mind plays these tricks where you keep reinforcing that belief. And so this core belief that was made at 9 was that I'm undesirable. That ended up being developed or reinforced over the next, let's say, like decade and a bit. In particular with dating, because undesirability, this is kind of a social piece, right? It's related to you and other people around you. And so since then, I haven't dated anyone, haven't been in relationships. At this point, I'm 23. And so most people at this stage have dated, which at this point, that's not a major point of insecurity. I'm pretty comfortable with that. But throughout the years, that was a thing where, kind of middle school, high school, people around you are dating, especially college. Now people are in long-term relationships. And I simply hadn't dated. And so that reinforced this belief of I'm undesirable. I haven't dated compared to everyone else around me because I'm not worth liking or worth loving or appreciating. And so the thing that's happening here is, on a surface level, kind of confirmation bias. I think maybe the more technical terminology is selective abstraction. That's the term in CBT. And it's part of this process called selective processing. And so our minds, we get a ton of input, a ton of sensory input throughout our day. Not just what the people around us talk, but like everything we see, everything we experience, all of our emotions at once. And our brain uses a ton of energy. And so if we took all of this input in, that would be very exhaustive. And as animals, our main focus is survival. So we want to optimize energy. Hence the reason why we have things like fat in our body. And so if we took all this input, it would be very exhaustive. And so we do this predictive processing where we select which input is important to us, and we only take that in. That's the only input we focus on, which makes sense, right? If there's some guy like screaming on the street, we're not going to take that in as we walk. That's not really important to us. But if our friend is talking to us, we try to classify that. And so there's several problematic patterns at play within this selective processing that's happening in my case. One is Hebbian wiring. So neurons that fire together tend to associate together. And so throughout the last decade and a half, as this is built out, what's been happening is there's been this one neuron of someone essentially rejecting me, whether that means not coming at my party or not wanting to date me, etc. And this other neuron of undesirability, and those have been firing together over and over again over like a decade and a half. And so that's reinforced a core belief, or more appropriately, it's reinforced this pathway between those two neurons that say, hey, these two things are associated. You can't disassociate them. The other issue is negativity bias. And so our amygdala weighs negative inputs that we get from the world more heavily than positive inputs, and it's a survival mechanism. Negative inputs are more scary. There's a higher chance they're going to harm us and impact our survival, and so we weigh them higher. So in this scenario, the situation that someone doesn't want me is weighed higher by our amygdala than the situation someone does want me, so we weigh that a little bit more. There's another third piece, which is dissonance reduction. When we hold contradictory information, that causes pain because, once again, it uses more energy. And so we try to drop the contradictory information. So if you have a particular perspective, in this case about undesirability, if there's contradictory information, we tend to drop that by default because it creates pain, rather than taking it for its merit and using that as evidence to seek that needed contradiction. And so in my case, what happens, coming back to this birthday piece, the present day birthday piece, if someone says they're busy, instead of taking them for their merit, my brain doesn't even capture the part where they say they're busy or unavailable. It simply captures the part that says they don't want to show up. And so they don't want to show up gets into my brain. And now these neurons about undesirability fire off, and this negativity bias and this dissonance reduction. And that gets interpreted as they don't love me, they don't want to spend time with me. And so that's kind of the lesson that keeps, that's a filtering that happens, which continuously reinforces the cycle of a core belief. Very toxic, and that's the reason this domino of this 9-year-old's birthday kicked off to this rough lesson to learn. The other piece that was part of the language that I used when describing the birthday was the negative self-talk. I kept describing myself as a loser. Hey, no one shows up to my birthday, I'm a loser. I said this about the 9-year-old as well, right? This kind of like fat loser kid who no one wanted to show up to. It sounds like I can get away with it because I'm talking about someone else. But that someone else is in fact me. It's just a different time span. That was in fact me. Plus, I'm only talking about it as if it's someone else because I talk about it the same way for myself. Either way, it's toxic. Clearly, like, we shouldn't be discussing or approaching different people and their situation in this way. It's simply kind of this toxicity, this coping mechanism. The correct approach, which generally we would have if someone IRL was next to us and describing this same thing, which is how I tend to respond when I'm talking to friends, is with empathy. In this case, I would say, hey, this poor 9-year-old, he's trying hard, he's trying to make friends, he's still growing up, he hasn't even hit puberty yet, and no one showed up as a birthday. I'm so sorry, that really sucks. I'm sorry you had to go through that. I hope it doesn't happen again. Know that you are loved. It's okay, right? That's kind of the empathy that you would approach with. But what I've been doing up until now is this pattern of judgment, right? This loser terminology. That is judgment. And so I want to discuss, where does this judgment come from? And then 2, logically, it seems to have merit, which is very interesting. Now the judgment piece, for me, it kind of developed through teenage years. Later teenage years, and then in particular in college. And so I grew up in Canada, great place, good people. But the one thing, basically the biggest trade-off of Canada, at least relative to the places with highest performance, definitely not relative to most places in the world, is that it lacks ambition. It really does not have ambition at scale, besides a couple of particular use cases like Waterloo, for example. And so I grew up post probably like 15, 16 years old. I was pretty ambitious. I want to do things with my life. And generally, we tend to thrive in environments where other people are like-minded. And you can always find cases like this. I have a few friends from back home that are like this, as well as people I've come across. But generally speaking, that the environment did not facilitate that. And so I was taught growing up to not really express myself, kind of this ambitious characteristic of me, to suppress that because no one else really understands. No one really gets you. And so, especially my college years, went to a shitty college, no one really had confidence. I had this big arc where I like locked in and grinded and learned a bunch of stuff, and eventually made it to what I feel are the highest performance places, SF in New York. I'm in SF now, and here I'm surrounded by the highest level of ambition and confidence and work. And so what ended up developing, especially in college years, was this kind of deep-rooted insecurity, because it wasn't just me. Like I think in isolation, if you're seeking that opportunity of like, I need to be in a more ambitious place or surrounded by ambitious people, that's fine. But this is the time I was like still figuring things out. I was very depressed. I was like going to therapy, trying to build self-confidence myself, and so I created a system of deep insecurity tied to ambition. And so I essentially created a scale where I would judge myself and everyone else around me, since I was so desperately looking for ambition, solely on ambition. And so if someone didn't have ambition, they were worthless, including myself. The people that did have ambition, I would like praise them. Very toxic on both ends of the spectrum. And so that's kind of where it developed from. But I've obviously, like thinking about this kind of logically, or sorry, kind of intuitively, it's toxic, it's bad. But logically speaking, it seems to have merit, right? If I didn't have all this hatred for the environment that I was in and kind of the people around me, then I wouldn't have had the work, kind of the natural motivation and energy to make it to where I want to be, which is where I am now. So it seems like the judgment was actually valuable. And this is the first counterexample that I learned this month that is very important, is that the judgment doesn't have merit. What I'm getting at and does have merit and is useful and you should continue is discernment. In other words, me saying group A of people and group B of people, they want different things in life, that's fine. So in other words, I want to do more ambitious things, these people don't. That's objectively true, that's fine, that's not judgment. Soon as you add the judgment piece of like, we want different things, therefore they're losers, therefore I'm a loser, that's the judgment piece, that's the toxic piece that really only comes in because I'm coping with insecurity myself. That doesn't come up naturally. That is not the axiomatic foundation. And so it's simply like a coping mechanism. It's the same thing you see with all like the Miami kids and LA kids and whatnot, where for them they're flexing their cars and followers, etc. They're all insecure, similar to the situation that I was in. And so me discerning that I was in the wrong environment back home, completely fine. The judgment piece was a problem. And the main place that I learned this lesson was with a friend. She was very sweet, great person. This was in college. And I essentially cut her off in a very toxic way because I flattened her entire multidimensional personality into the single scale of ambition. And I said, hey, she's worthless. Let me stop hanging out with her. Very toxic. And me cutting it off and it causing a bunch of drama and feeling really bad about it, that taught me that, hey, judgment and discernment can be different. But this also has a bit of a problem, because we can say, let me think about this. Discernment is fine. Let's say we accept that now. We have different beliefs. Group A and Group B have different beliefs. That's fine. But my counterexample is like, if you don't hate that Group A or the way they live, then you will end up as that Group A. You want to dislike that behavior in order to change it, which feels like from the success standpoint that feels right. If you don't hate your lifestyle, you're not going to change it. You're just going to do it forever. And so once again, maybe this judgment that I'm having for lack of ambition is valid. Here's the counter argument that once again I realized recently. Now we're differentiating between divergence and deficiency. Similar to discernment, it's fair to say that we have divergence. I can say, hey, this environment is problematic for the goals that I'm chasing. It undermines my goals. It is a bad environment. And therefore we need to divert me and the current base. We need to go on different paths in order for me to reach my goals. That's fine. The deficiency piece is a toxic piece. Me saying, hey, this group are losers, therefore I need to run away. We can skip that and still enable divergence. I can still say, hey, this is the wrong environment for me. I need to look for something else without adding that judgment piece. And so that Group A, now we allow them to have integrity. We allow myself to respect them, and in other words, respect myself, without seeing them as deficient people. And so let's think about kind of like take a step back and figure out what I've done here. Both these arguments that make sense, let's accept them. The problem at hand is that I'm essentially measuring my and everyone else's self-worth as human beings on ambition, on success, on achievement. That is the only metric that I'm using to measure self-worth. And that's a problem, because it's a very narrow view of society. People are multidimensional beings. They have strengths and weaknesses and successes and traumas and relationships and people they fall in love with. If we flatten their essentially quality of being human into a single metric, which is ambition, then first of all, it's a projection of insecurity. This is all just simply projection. And then two, it's very toxic. That's not how humans work in society. We should not be judging them in that way. And the solve is quite simple here. It's simply a piece of awareness. There's a problem I've noticed in myself and this judgment of others as a flattening. Just have awareness over it every time it comes up and say, hey, I'm doing this thing again, that's fine. And more you have awareness, it kind of goes away. That's fine. But I want to dig into this habituation of tying my self-worth to ambition, to success and metrics. Because on a surface level, this makes quite a lot of sense. If you're trying to do extraordinary things, let me think about this. You need to be the process of attaching some level of, you need to place a lot of weight on achievement. If you want to reach hyper success, that's just a part of it. This concept of like having perfect balance, it simply does not work. And I'll get to that in a little sec. But let's assume it's right. You're allowed to have big goals, big scary goals. That seems healthy. Let's do that. The problem is, or what am I thinking? Having an engine of achievement is fine, and I think that you need that. If you want to do extraordinary things, you need to place a lot of weight on achievement. That needs to be a relevant metric that you chase. The way I'm doing it seems to be problematic. There's another distinction, which is the concept of a goalpost. If you have a single goalpost that you're chasing, then let's say your goal is to get a particular job. Eventually, if you try hard enough, if you have enough focus, assuming you have some baseline of privilege and resources, you're going to end up reaching that goalpost. And having a singular goalpost is problematic because once you reach that, you plateau. You don't really do anything else. That's why most of us have kind of intrinsically adapted to and learned this behavior of moving your goalpost. Once in the process, you're achieving the first goalpost, you generally have a vision of the next goals that you're trying to reach. And so when you reach that first one, you have other goals to look at. In other words, it's this concept of a moving goalpost that allows you to achieve on a higher scale. That is valid. I think that's a very important behavior to have. So that brings me back to my case. What's the problem here? If this is the mentality that's driving all the problematic behavior and thought processes, coming back to this piece of undesirability and judgment, what's the problem? The problem is I'm attaching my self-worth to achievement, right? What I've done is I've flattened human beings into a single metric, which is how successful they are or how successful they can be. And that is what self-worth is. Now, if we bring this concept of a moving goalpost, the goal that I'm chasing is ever moving. In other words, I can never actually reach my goal. It always moves, and that's where my self-worth is. In other words, I can never have self-worth, right? Self-worth is something I'm chasing, but that thing I'm chasing always moves. I can never actually get to a point where I have self-worth. And the perfect example of this is my journey over the last few years. I started off like getting kicked out of school, had no friends, was very depressed, really hated life, had no one to really talk to. Most of my friends I didn't speak to anymore. I was living alone. Post-pandemic, I lost my confidence, my social skills, ended up at a shitty college, didn't have a long-term vision anymore. Just really kind of a shitty place to be in. And I created a long-term goal, went to therapy, learned emotions, created long-term goals that I started kind of biting off time and time. Ended up being what I call this 37-month journey. Eventually ended up making into very high kind of talent dense, rich growth-oriented environments like SF, where I'm living right now, and it took astronomical amount of growth, virality online. And so I undertook this massive journey that completely, fundamentally transformed who I was as a person. And I did what at the beginning was physically impossible to achieve. And yet I'm sitting here scared to text 4 friends for a birthday. My point being, no matter how much I actually achieve in life, my self-worth being attached to that goalpost has made it so I don't actually ever have self-worth. I'm always undesirable. That's very problematic. And I have a kind of a, obviously not mathematically sound, but a pseudo proof that demonstrates this. I wanted to dig into this earlier. Let me get my laptop. I want to show you. I feel like I can probably share my screen. Let me open this up. I wrote kind of a proof to demonstrate this piece. Oh, it's recording, I think. Oh, okay. I think it's recording. So I made a bit of a proof to demonstrate the problem here, and essentially define that the mentality or this behavioral pattern I have is problematic on several fronts, and I'll kind of dig into this. What are we trying to do? The overarching goal here is we're trying to reach hyper success, right? That's our goal. We want to reach some kind of extraordinary growth. We need to define a couple of antecedents in order to allow for that hyper success, upon which we can build out a proof. The first thing, worthlessness is bad. This one pretty intuitive. If we constantly feel worthless, you can kind of just assume you're not going to be really successful. Or let's even ignore the successful piece. This is just like, it makes sense. You need to have some level of worth. The second piece here, which I just spoke about, my worth right now is tied to the goalpost. So I have this goalpost. That's where my worth is tied to, because I evaluate self-worth as a metric of ambition or success or achievement. That's K. L, the goalpost is ever moving. And this is needed for growth. We need to constantly move our goalpost. If we have a single goalpost, we actually don't amount to anything. We need to continually move that. Next one, we need continuous failure, once again, for growth. This one, pretty intuitive, but I'll kind of dig into it. There's 2 main reasons. Failure is what leads to learning. And so if we fail something, we see what went wrong, we fix it, and we use that as a lesson to learn. That's just the process of growth. Second piece, and this is the recursive definition, or the recursive extension of this, is we need to be comfortable with repeated failure, right? So we need failure for learning, but a single lesson isn't going to help us achieve anything. We need to have tons and tons of failures. And if we're having that many failures, we need to be comfortable with that failure. And so that ties into this kind of M antecedent that we have. One more antecedent that I want to go through, which is that we need sustained effort. You can't do one activity on a Saturday and suddenly you're successful. You need to continually put in effort. Let's kind of dig into the proof. The thing I'm doing, and we've discussed this already, so I'll skim over it, but if we take antecedent K and L, my worth is tied to the goalpost is ever moving, I reinforce that I'm worthlessness. It's not physically possible to have worth because my worth is tied to an infinitely moving goalpost, right? Now, what does this lead to? There's 4 consequences that this argument, this scenario that we've derived leads to. 4 cases. The first one is that I ended up giving up because if I can never have worth, then I lack self-confidence, I eventually give up. So that's the first scenario. Second scenario, I end up just avoiding failure because, we've used this J here. Every time I fail, I feel worthless, which we know kind of from the human standpoint, we want to avoid. It feels bad. And so I avoid failure altogether. Third case that maybe perhaps happens is I start pretending to be successful. And so instead of actually doing anything that would lead to success, I start pretending I'm successful. So this is like the LA Miami effect, where you get a bunch of followers, you get a boob job, you take a bunch of like weight loss drugs, and you buy cars and fancy clothes and purses, because you're not actually successful, you're insecure about it, and so you project by using material goods or anything else that falsely demonstrates your worth. Fourth case, let's just assume that even though you feel worthless, you just continue to grind, right? Our first case was you end up giving up. Let's take this fourth case where, sure, you're worthless, but let's just lock in, bro, right? Just lock in, generational lock-in type shit, right? 4 cases. These are the 4 consequences. The scenario is that I don't actually end up, or I'll get to that. These 4 behaviors, what actually happens as a result? What are our implications? So the first one was saying I give up, right? What does that have to do? Well, I don't reach hyper success because I gave up. This one is pretty obvious. Let's move on to the next one. For this one, this is about, if we go back to 2, I start avoiding failure. And if we look at our antecedent, M, we need continuous failure for growth. So we just violated M. And so, in other words, we don't reach hyper success because we violated M. Let's look at 3. This one is about me faking, like falsely pretending to be successful instead of actually being successful. Clearly, we don't reach hyper success either because we're pretending, right? This one's obvious as well. 4th one, this was saying, hey, I feel worthless, but I lock in anyway. This is also a problem because it violates antecedent N. N, if you remember, was saying we need sustained effort. But each time we feel worthless, which is going to happen repeatedly, there's an aversive tax. It sucks. It feels hard, and we need to kind of just accept it, right? We need to take it on the chin. And so each time we do that, it builds this tax of pain, and that's unsustainable, and that sustainability is what N requires. So every single scenario that results from this argument that we derived creates a scenario where I don't reach hyper success, which is what we're trying to reach. Clearly, there's some kind of contradiction here. So let's dig into our antecedents again and see what we can eliminate. We have J. Can we drop J? Not really, because it's biological, right? Like us feeling worthless, not having us needing to feel worth, that's quite biological. So we can't really drop that. L, M, and N, we can't drop because these are quite kind of axiomatic principles for success. You need all of these growth-oriented principles for success, so we can't drop them either. Therefore, we must drop K. We have no other choice but to drop K. In other words, in order to reach hyper success, if we even want to make this proof possible, we have no option but to separate our self-worth from that ever-moving goalpost. And so let me shut this off. And let me get my camera back. And so that's a very important understanding. But I have another counter-argument. This still doesn't fully sit right with me. The argument of like let's separate our self-worth from the goalpost, it makes sense. We just made a whole proof about it. But what doesn't sit well with me is that if we want to reach hyper success, you need to put all your eggs in one basket. It is physically not possible. The subset of people that go on vacations, that have a family that they can give adequate time to and raise their kids really well and spend a lot of time with them, and they watch a couple of shows on Netflix that they really enjoy, and they get really good exercise, and they get good sleep and diet. They visit different countries and explore the world, and they have lots of friends that they spend regularly time with, and they have $1 billion company. That subset doesn't exist. It's not physically possible. Because if it was, every single person on the street would have hyper success. Logically, this is quite obvious. You need a lot of dedicated effort in order to do something extraordinary. By definition, it's extraordinary. It's different from everyone else. So, and the other thing is, if you're going to do that, you need to put all your eggs into one basket. And so, this basket of achievement. And that's quite scary because there's a 99.999% chance you're going to fail. Logically speaking, it's nearly impossible to become a billionaire out of nothing. It's statistically impossible. It's such a small chance. And so if we were rational, sound, logical beings, we would never undertake that endeavor. Which is exactly why the people who do undertake it, and it doesn't have to be for startups, it can be whatever other ambitious endeavor it is, they have so much conviction, which is the people I'm surrounded by here in SF, that they chase that 0.001% chance. And because they have so much conviction, they sacrifice everything else in their life to chase that one thing. They indeed put all their eggs in one basket. And with all their conviction, assuming they have some baseline and privilege and some level of resources and connections, they make that into reality. We're seeing that in the last 3 years, there's been the highest number of billionaires we've ever seen because we're in an inflection point, and people that I know that were just regular dudes are now billionaires or very close because they undertook that 0.001% chance. And they put all their eggs into one basket. So it comes back to my argument. It makes sense to actually tie your self-worth to that achievement. Because if you want to do extraordinary things, you need to be fully invested. You need to be so invested that you don't love yourself unless you achieve things, right? It seems quite logical. What's the problem? The problem is, if you remember, we said we've attached our self-worth to an ever-moving goalpost. What is that goalpost? That goalpost is, in fact, achievement. That achievement is exactly equivalent to the basket of eggs. In other words, I've put my own self-worth into the basket of eggs. I myself am an egg. That's the thing that's problematic, because we demonstrated with the pseudo-proof that two important things. If we tie our self-worth to that ever-moving goalpost, first of all, we'll never feel worth. We'll never be desirable or feel worth. But two, more importantly, following this argument, we'll never actually paradoxically achieve hyper-success. It's physically not possible. I need to disassociate those two. And so if I put my self-worth within that same basket of eggs, then I will also never achieve hyper-success. It feels paradoxical, but that's exactly the truth. And so what is the only rational argument that is left? Because everything else that I've assumed, and I've been doing up until now, and is the mentality that I've worked with, paradoxically does not lead to hyper-success. The only route that's possible is to have unconditional self-worth, which is a given for a lot of people. They've kind of grown up that way. That was not the case for me. That's not what I learned growing up. And so it feels crazy. But the only possible route is to have unconditional self-worth, unconditional self-love. You accept yourself, other people accept you, you accept other people, irrespective of if they fail or not fail or how much level of success do they get to. This is the unconditional love piece. And so this ties into this 9-year-old's lesson perfectly as well about birthdays. Because I had created a system where self-worth and love was attached to this metric of achievement. And so I created a system where unconditional love was physically not possible. But unconditional love is the thing that I'm seeking for both myself and for others, and vice versa. And so my system that I played in, that I interacted with, was broken to begin with. And so the only possible route forward in order to reach success, as well as be happy with my life and invite friends on a birthday, is unconditional love. It's crazy, bro. That's actually crazy.